Techno Wizard, and today we are continuing our series on learning about Hegel, reading through Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And of course, we're still in the preface here. This week, we're going to be going over sections 50 and 51. Um, so I'm going to read my summary I wrote last time of the last section, sections 48 and 49. I said, in this section, Hegel finishes his tirade against mathematical philosophy by talking about how all the theorems, proofs, propositions, and so on are too conceptually constrained to adequately grapple with the full breadth of conscious experience, and thus is not particularly useful in doing philosophy. He mentions how philosophy should be somewhere between casual conversations and pompous scientific pedantry, meaning it should be comprehensive yet approachable, rigorous yet humble. It deals with the necessity of notion, as he calls it. In essence, the grasping of all manner of concepts coming together in a cohesive shape. And Dr. Sadler shows how Hegel views truth as basically a organic thing that grows and changes through time and through the progression of knowledge. So yeah, I think that's a good. Well, let's see what Dr. Sadler said to see if this is a good summary of the last section before we go into my pretext here. So, Dr. Sadler says here Hegel discusses the relationship between two interconnected approaches, the observation of the development of consciousness taking place in the phenomenology, and the perspective of the finished, entirely articulated system in the logic. He also continues his criticism of reliance on modes of presentation in philosophy which model themselves after mathematics, a topic which he treats in both the phenomenology and the later science of logic. Mathematics in its distinctive mode of cognition works with magnitude and dead space, quantity and discreteness in logic. Dead space meaning quantity and discreteness in logic, which is fine for that discipline, but inadequate for understanding living entities and truth as self movement. Yeah, so Dr. Sadler brings in the other works he's done. I have no idea. It's my first time reading any sort of philosophy, much less Hegel, so I don't know about those other works. But I think, it's a great kind of summary, right? It's the fact that in the last section, he's talking about bringing home this point how math, you know, and viewing the universe as a mathematical construct, right, is not necessarily a great philosophical framework because math kind of works in kind of set integers, right, or set finite kind of systems. And so, for philosophy, for phenomenology, right, for the experience of life, for consciousness, it has so many nuances and subjective kind of change, right? Kind of uh, um, progressions and things like that. That it has to be a dynamic system, right? It has to be a living system. This is why he uses the term like forget the exact term, but he uses this idea of like an organic structure, right? This self-living, this or I think he calls it self-movement, right, of truth, because as we learn more about history, about knowledge, about information, and the conscious experience, our understanding of the world, of the universe, of ourselves, even changes, right? And math can't really encapsulate all of that. So you can't really use math as a philosophical construct. At least that's how I'm seeing it here. But let's go ahead and get started into this next section. Let me go ahead and cue this up. Full screen. Here we go. All right. So now, without further ado, let's begin, shall we? I'm sorry, I love that intro. I stole it from this YouTuber by the name of Narc, Narc, who does videos on MMOs, and I just really loved his bits he has. But let's begin.
Of course, the triadic form must not be regarded as scientific when it is reduced to a lifeless schema, a mere shadow, and when scientific organization is degraded into a table of terms. Kant rediscovered this triadic form by instinct, but in his work it was still lifeless and uncomprehended. Since then it has, however, been raised to its absolute significance, and with it the true form in its true content has been presented, so that the notion of science
Oops, I just saw the chat. It's my baby in there saying hello, hello. She said that 3 minutes ago. I can't believe I missed it. But I didn't have the chat open. But yeah, sorry.
Science has emerged. This formalism of which we have already spoken generally and whose style
Sorry,
we've emerged,
I
and
gotta go
its
back
true
now.
content has been presented.
He says, regarding scientific when it's reduced to a lifeless schema, a mere shadow, and when scientific organization is degraded into a table of terms. Kant rediscovered this triadic form by instinct, but in his work it was still lifeless and uncomprehended. Since then, it has, however, been raised into its absolute significance, and with it, the true form of its nature has been presented, so that the notion of science has emerged. Yeah, so goes back into the idea that it has to be, you need a living kind of form, right, to really talk about philosophy. Um, the philosophical, I guess, the triadic form. I forgot exactly what he's talking about. I think he was talking about like the kind of movement of knowledge. It kind of takes the three forms of shoot, I forgot exactly what he said. I'm sure Douglas Adler will go back over it, but basically like the ignorance stage, and then learning more of it and kind of bringing it back together again. Um, or I guess kind of like an ignorance exploration and kind of bringing it back together, resolution, or if you want to call it that. I know that's not what it's called, but the kind of triadic form. So yeah.
So that the notion of science has emerged. This formalism of which we have already spoken generally and whose style we wish here to describe in more detail, imagines that it has comprehended and expressed the nature and life of a form when it has endowed it with some determination of the schema as a predicate.
Mm.
The predicate may be subjectivity or objectivity, or say magnetism, electricity, etc., contraction or expansion, east or west, and the like. Such predicates can be multiplied to infinity, since in this way each determination or form can again be used as a form or moment in the case of an other, and each can gratefully perform the same service for an other.
Hmm.
In this sort of circle of reciprocity, one never learns what the thing itself is, nor what the one or the other is.
Interesting. So we use this word predicate. That's an interesting word there, because nowadays I only really hear that word in terms of like a sentence structure. So I wonder what else he means there. I'm guessing like affirmative denied to the subject in the propositional logic. Term designating a property or relation. Interesting. All these types. So yeah, predicate may be subjectivity or objectivity. Same idea. So yeah, I guess they're talking about how these different properties could be, deemed as like a philosophical construct or an idea of how we describe the world, how we learn and understand things. So that's how I'm taking it so far.
One never learns what the thing itself is, nor what the one or the other is. In such a procedure, sometimes determination of sense are picked up from everyday intuition, and they are supposed, of course, to mean something different from what they say. Sometimes what is in itself meaningful, for example, pure determinations of thought, like subject, object, substance, cause, universal, and so on. These are used just as thoughtlessly and uncritically as we
Mm.
use them in everyday life, or we use ideas like strength and weakness, expansion and contraction. The metaphysics is in the former case as unscientific as
Mm.
are our sensuous representations in the latter.
Ooh, throwing shots there. All right. Like these ideas that we have that
Inside
we're kind of bandied about, um, even in that, these circles, these philosophical circles, these philosophy circles are not really that in depth, right? They seem like they are, but it depends more on an intuitive understanding of things rather than a structure. I guess that's what he's saying there, which is interesting. Throwing shots, but let's see.
section 50, Hegel is now going to begin a new, progressive, sustained critique of what he is calling formalism. He just finished up with criticizing several other things, including mathematical cognition and philosophy that would base itself upon that. Now he's turning instead to criticizing something that's a little bit closer in time to him, his fellow German idealists.
Mm. And that's the triadic form too. I can't believe I was forgetting those words: synthesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or no, synthesis, antithesis, What's the third one?
And
I
he's
can't
not
remember
actually
now. See.
attacking them by name. You have to sort of read between the lines, except for, of course, Kant, who he's going to
Oh, thesis,
mention
I
almost
guess.
immediately in this one. And you want to ask yourself, what is he actually doing here? What is the center of this critique? Is it purely critical, or is there something that is going to actually be progressive, positive, going forth from this? So we want to talk about the triadic form. Triad, of course, triangle, three. And he says that Kant rediscovered this, but didn't really know what he was onto. And the question that we want to pose is this going to degenerate into merely a schema that we can shove anything we like into, which is what he thinks that some of the fellow German idealists are doing.
Hmm.
And I think that Hegel, if he were to be around today, he would say that a lot of people who claim to actually be interested in, admirers of, studying Hegel, actually do this with Hegel's own works, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Or is the triadic form going to provide the basis for finally making not only philosophy, but science in general, scientific? So let's look at what he says. He says, the triadic form must not be regarded as scientific when it is reduced to a schema. If you're just sort of taking content and saying, how can we shove this in here? How can we use this to make sense of things? Because we need to have a triadic form. Hegel would say, look, there's no, there's nothing that says that you have to have a triadic form. As a matter of fact, you notice that I've got here the famous Hegelian thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and if you do read through a lot of Hegel's works, you will see him using triadic forms quite often. As a matter of fact, perhaps he's a little schematic about it at times, but he doesn't always make recourse to the triad. Sometimes, what's going on is primarily between two things. Sometimes it's a whole manifold that is being addressed or discussed. So you don't want to think that Hegelian philosophy really boils down to thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I know that oftentimes when we're helping out beginners, we present it in that way, but we're really doing them a disservice if they begin to use that in a schematic form, thinking that we can put anything we like into it, like shirt is a thesis, and what's a shirt without a tie? That's the antithesis of it. And what brings it all together? Oh, a jacket. And now we've got a synthesis, a greater whole, an ensemble. You see how...
Yeah, this is a great point, because I'm new to actual philosophical texts, but in my going around YouTube looking up philosophy videos, you always hear, oh, that's a Hegelian thing, that's a Hegelian thing. You're talking about synthesis, antithesis, blah blah blah. I'm just like, well, I wonder what they mean. So as I've finally been going through this, I'm just like, this is very, like, what a lot of these people are talking about is usually very surface level idea of Hegel. And I'm only like 50 sections, 50 paragraphs into the preface, and I can see that. So I'm like, what are these people missing? Like, did these people read the book? Because it seems Hegel is directly against that idea of being too formulaic, right? That's like one of the big takeaways I'm getting from Hegel so far, is that you don't want to be so formulaic when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to getting a comprehensive structure of what consciousness means, what reality means, and all the other stuff. And I agree. Like, whenever you look into um reality, just in general, like how the world works and things like that, uh no model, right, no formula, no one kind of subject can encapsulate all of it, right? You need to use different tools for different reasons to understand different aspects of it. So the fact that people kind of reduce Hegel's own philosophy to this is really concerning and unfortunate, right? So yeah, this is tough, man.
silly that is. You can do that sort of thing all day long, but you're not really doing philosophy, and you're not really learning about anything important that way. So he says, Kant rediscovered this triadic form by instinct. What does he mean there? Well, if you read Kant's first critique, you're going to see him talking about the categories of the understanding. And the categories of the understanding are pure determinations of thought that allow us to make sense of things. And Kant always had a difficult time explaining exactly how these categories hook up with the empirical reality that we encounter. And that's the question that Hegel is concerned with here. How do we intelligibly connect the realm of metaphysics, or pure determinations of thought, with what it is that we actually experience, act upon, are acted upon, live within, all of that sort of stuff. The realm of the senses and of the understanding. How do we connect those up? So Hegel says, look, Kant rediscovers this, and in his work that was still lifeless and uncomprehended. Since then, it's been raised to its absolute significance, and with it the true form and its true content has been presented, so that the notion of science has emerged. Now, he doesn't mean that that's happening here in the preface. He means that that's happening through the rest of the book. So you're going to see triads going through the rest of the book. Some, like I said, more in some places than in others. And then he says this formalism that we've already spoken of, in whose style we want to describe here in more detail, we're going to do a slightly more detailed critique, imagines it has comprehended and expressed the nature and life of the form when it's endowed it with some determination of the schema as a predicate. So what are we talking about there? Take anything that you like. Again, we'll use this really silly example that I just came up with on the fly. Shirt. So let's call the shirt the thesis. Now, what does that actually tell you? Not really anything. And now we'll call the tie the antithesis. And, why did the tie have to be the antithesis? Why not start with the tie as the thesis and then say, well, you have to have something to hang the tie on, so, obviously, maybe it's just the collar that's the thesis. You see that this is very arbitrary. There's no intrinsic necessity to this. That's what Hegel is upset about. That's what he's criticizing here. He's saying that now we're not going to talk about shirts and ties or haberdashery or anything like that. Let's talk about the sort of things that these guys were really fascinated with. Electricity, magnetism, contraction and expansion, east and west. And he says, you can multiply these predicates to infinity. You can come up with as many of them as you like. You can cram whatever you like into these triads, or really even just dyads. And so long as you're not explaining why these things are actually connected with each other, you're not explaining anything. You're not giving anybody any real knowledge.
Right, that reductiveness. Shadow Games, thanks so much for coming to the chat here. He says, they say, oversimplification is a dual-edged sword. Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure if it started then, probably not, but definitely you see a huge uptick of reductionism, of kind of simplistic determinism in the 1800s and going forward to today, where people can think about reducing the world into imagine it's a machine. Actually, don't imagine it's actually a machine. The universe is a machine, and this is how it functions, and blah blah blah. I'm like, wait, what? Right? But our current understanding of a lot of the kind of laws of physics and everything like that bleeds out into everything else. It's useful, right, to be somewhat reductive sometimes. It's necessary to do like math and to do physics and things like that. But if you're talking about philosophy, if you're talking about understanding the comprehensive whole of reality, you don't want to be that simple, that oversimplified. But yeah, definitely.
You're giving the appearance of knowledge, certainly, and you're saying some things that sound profound, but they don't actually connect up with anything and provide intelligibility. That is, a capacity to understand how the things fit in with each other.
Right.
So he says, you can multiply these to infinity. In this way, each determination or form can be used as a form or movement in the case of an other, and can gratefully perform the same service for another. And he talks about this as a circle of reciprocity. That means that these things are connected with each other. It's interesting because in the that actually fits into Kant's category, so that's sort of a side note.
Interesting.
What's the upshot of this? It looks as if, because you're using some sort of schema, as if you're contributing to knowledge about something. But the trouble with formalism is that the content just winds up being wherever you want to place it. So you don't need to have 3, you could have 4, you could have 28. You could say something similar about just one example, about the semiotic square derived by Grammas and used by people who are interested in semiotics.
Semiotics.
Just stick whatever content in you want, and you're going to connect things up with each other in some way or another. But does that actually tell you about the content, the things that you're trying to make sense of? And Hegel says, no, it doesn't. Here's the problem. You never learn what the thing itself is, nor what the one or the other is. And then he talks about something else. He says, in this procedure, sometimes determinations of sense are picked up from everyday intuition. We have a world that we, in fact, experience. This is a color. There's other colors in this. Those are things that we experience. You're hearing me right now. This is, a visible representation and an oral representation. It's not in the realm of, smell or touch or anything like that. In any case, we pick things up from that, and then we shove them into these boxes or into, slots in the schema, and then we say to ourselves, yes, we mean that, but, in a different way. Like Hegel says, these are picked up from everyday intuition, but they're supposed to mean something different from what they say. So what would they mean that's different? Well, sometimes we're talking about determinations of pure thought in the realm of metaphysics, metaphysical conceptions like subject, object, substance, cause, universal. So if you want to, we can say, here's just one thing. Let's get, the thesis here will be subject, and the antithesis will be object. And this is a very popular one for philosophy. How do we overcome the subject-object dichotomy? Well, which one are you actually talking about? Are you talking about the one of knowledge? Action? Are we talking about the fact that subjects can actually become objects? We have to get determinate with this. We actually have to say what the things consist in instead of just, throwing these nebulous terms around as if we're actually doing some philosophy. And then people come along and say, oh, well, what would the synthesis be? Maybe it's going to be, something more concrete. It's the person. Or, why have that? Why not have something else? Maybe it's God. Or why not have, and we can do whatever we like with this. You can stick whatever content you like into there, and it will make some sort of sense because you already have a schema in place. But you're not really doing philosophy when you do that.
Right.
So he says, these are used as thoughtlessly and uncritically as we use them in everyday life, where we use ideas like strength and weakness. The metaphysics is, in the former case, as unscientific as our sensuous representations in the latter. This is not the way to do philosophy. This is not the way to do metaphysics, he's saying. Now notice he is saying we should be doing metaphysics.
I like this section.
Instead of the inner life and self-movement of its existence, this kind of simple determinateness of intuition, which means here self-knowledge, is predicated in accordance with a superficial analogy, and this external, empty application of the formula is called a construction. This formalism is just like any other. What a dullard a man must be who could not be taught in a...
Shadow says he disrespected that book, though. Hurts my feelings. What book are you referring to? Dr. Sadler talking about this book? I don't think so.
quarter of an hour the theory that there are aesthetic, and indirectly aesthetic diseases, and as many modes of treatment, and since till quite recently such instruction sufficed, who could not hope to be transformed in this short space of time from an empirical into a theoretical physician? The
Mm.
formalism of such a philosophy of nature teaches, say, that the understanding is electricity, or the animal is nitrogen, or that they are the equivalent of the South or North Pole, or represent it. Whether all this is expressed as baldly as here, or even concocted with more terminology and confronted with such a power which brings together things that appear to lie far apart, and with the violence suffered by the passive things of sense through such association, and which imparts to them the notion's semblance but saves itself the trouble of doing the main thing, that is, expressing the notion itself or the meaning of the sensuous representation.
Mm.
Confronted with all of this, the untutored mind may be filled with admiration and astonishment, and may
Mm.
venerate in it the profound work of genius. It may be delighted too with the clarity of such characterizations, and since these replace the abstract notion with something that can be intuitively apprehended, and so made more pleasing,
Mm.
and it may congratulate itself on such a feeling of kinship of soul with such a splendid performance.
Yo, this is crazy because it sounds almost exactly like what happens with, I don't want to call it any specific group because it happens with, I was going to say conservatives, but also happens with liberals, right? It happens with anybody who deems like some authority or some, you know, smarter person, some wise person, some powerful person as more enlightened, right? You see this all the time in grifts, in multi-level marketing, in marketing in general, and a company, right? Where you have some person who's put on a pedestal, and everything they say that seems somewhat, interesting is deemed as like the deepest thing ever. I really hate this in hip hop. Right, this is a really big problem in rap, and really probably any other music. But I'm especially pay attention to this in rap, where you have an artist. I'm gonna say names like Hobson or Dax, or even Logic, right? Who talk about subjects that, and they do have some level of interest in there, right? They have some level of insight into those subjects, but then they, uh, you know their metaphors and their analogies are deemed as, oh, it's so deep, it's so intricate. I'm like, no, it's really a surface level ideology. It's a surface level, understanding of this subject. Like, what are you even talking about? And this happens all the time with all manner of people and subjects and areas, and it's crazy that he's calling this out here, where it happens with these philosophy magnates. um, Shadow says the one he was grabbing messed the whole book spine up. Yeah, yeah, he's talking about, yeah, the way he holds the paperback book in his hand. Um, Shoot, man, I don't even use books like anymore. I read, you just read digitally, so I don't even feel that anymore. And when I used to read books, I did feel you though, because I'd be very careful about how I open my books and things like that. So I understand that. But yeah, it's the Drake effect. Yeah, it's just so disgusting, right? And so, but at the same time, so interesting that it happens on so many levels, right? Not just with like simpletons, like, or regular people, but also with philosophers, right? With people who are writing these intricate books, with people like Kant, right? Again, I have not read Kant myself, so I can't say too much about it, but I have seen a number of summaries and takes and all this analysis on that, and it is really concerning. Like, I've seen excerpts from him, and it's really concerning that some of these topics that he talks about are deemed as like, oh, the so deep and incredible, but like if you give it like 2 seconds of thought, or okay, maybe 20 minutes of thought, if you give it more thought, then you're like, wait, it's not that deep, right? It's not that insightful. um but yeah, it's crazy that it happens on so many levels for such a long period of time, and he's calling it out here in the 1800s. Amazing.
The knack of this kind of wisdom is as quickly learned as it is easy to practice. Once familiar, the repetition of it becomes as insufferable as the repetition of a conjuring trick already seen through. The instrument of this monotonous formalism is no more difficult to handle than a painter's palette having only two colors, say red and green. The one for coloring the surface when a historical scene is wanted, the other for landscapes. It would be hard to decide which is greater in all this, the casual ease with which everything in heaven and on earth and under the earth is coated with this broth of color,
Hmm.
or the conceit regarding the excellence of this universal recipe. Each supports the other.
Hmm.
What results from this method of labeling all that is in heaven and earth with the few determinations of the general schema and pigeonholing everything in this way is nothing less than a report clear as noonday on the universe as an organism that is as a synoptic table like a skeleton with scraps of paper stuck all over it. Or
Wow.
like the rows of closed and labeled boxes in a grocer's stall. It is as easy to read off as either of these, and just as all the flesh and blood has been stripped from this skeleton, and the no longer living essence has been packed away in the boxes, so in the report the living essence of the matter has been stripped away or boxed up dead.
Oh my gosh. Yo, he's really throwing shots right here. He's this is a whole diss track. Like seriously. He says when you basically when you pigeonhole everything, it reduces it to a synoptic table, like like a skeleton with scraps of paper stuck all over it. Like your book is just a skeleton with scraps of paper. It's paper mache, or like the rows of clothes and labeled boxes in a grocer's stall. Says it is as easy to read off as either of these, and just as all the flesh and blood has been stripped from the skeleton and the no longer living essence has been packed away in the boxes. So in the report, the living essence of the matter has been stripped away or boxed up dead. So he's saying like the way these people reduce, reality, consciousness, phenomenology, right? Philosophy into these little, little determinate, not even determinate, but these little oversimplified intuitions, right, is very much disgusting. It's like killing a thing and saying, "Oh yeah, look at my human." Like, um, it just this is great. This is great. Like, yes. So I'm talking about bars, right? Like, imagine he was putting the diss track with this, and he's just like, "Oh, I would have turned this into a rap. I wish I could rap, but like this is amazing, right? And it definitely is something that you see every day in our regular life today, to this day, right? You can turn on the news and see this, right? You can turn on, you can go to school. Like half of our schooling, whether you're in grade school or in higher education, quote unquote higher education, does the same thing on a regular basis, right? Capitalism as a whole makes his job to do this. It turns things into capital, into nothing but supply and demand. And it really is concerning that our entire, society has turned into this reductiveness. It's crazy. Shadow says, I went to the High Museum and almost every artwork wasn't deep at all. It's like the painting became deep after the artist died. Oh my gosh. We can talk about that a little bit because again, I'm not like an artist myself. I'm not an aficionado or anything like that, but I feel you on that, man. I go to the High Museum. Are you in Atlanta? You must be in Atlanta. But like, I went there before too. I looking at art. I'm just like, oh, what's going on here? And I know that's a typical thing, where people say, "Oh, you just don't get it," things like that. But nah, a lot of art is just interesting because somebody else says it's interesting. Right? Reminds me of what's going on in NFTs. Right? It's only valuable because people believe it's valuable. There's no inherent value there. It's not giving you anything. It's not producing anything, but people believe it's valuable, and so there it is. Right? And yeah, sure, maybe that kind of sort of works for some things, especially when to put a price tag on them, but that doesn't work for philosophy, right? That doesn't work for actually understanding reality and what's around you. And yeah, it's just man, it's just sad that this has turned into all of our society. It really is. Continues. It says, "Nah, they yeah, Never going back. Yeah, yeah. It really is unfortunate. And I've seen some good art there. Some don't get me wrong, but I've seen more really great art going at a street, going to those street festivals, right? Um where you have those vendors who make their own art and put it like in a little tent and stuff like that. I've seen way better art there because you can see like the personality, you can see the imagination, you can see the creativity people put into these different art styles, and it could be realistic or impressionist or abstract or whatever. But you can feel almost that feeling that they put into it versus. Usually in these museums, it's just like feels like static, and it's like what's going on here? Exactly. Festivals are way better. Yeah. Yeah. It's insane.
As either of these, and just as all the flesh and blood has been stripped from this skeleton, and the no longer living essence has been
Bars, man.
packed away in the boxes, so in the report the living essence of the matter has been stripped away or boxed up dead.
Crazy.
We have already remarked that this way of thinking at the same time culminates in a style of painting that is absolutely monochromatic,
Yep.
for it is ashamed of its schematic distinctions, these products of reflection, and submerges them all in the void of the absolute,
Mm,
from which pure identity, formless whiteness, is produced.
mm,
This monochromatic character of the schema and its lifeless determination, this absolute identity, and the transition from one to the other are all equally products of the lifeless
mm.
understanding and external cognition.
Beautiful. Goodness. He went hard. He went hard in that
I think that
section.
a lot of people don't actually realize until they spend some time with Hegel that he can be quite a funny guy.
Yes.
And
That
that the humor in his work
was
is
amazing.
often quite biting and satirical. You got to like pay close attention to what he's saying. You might see it as just being arrogant or scornful, but he's really
Ah, man, he
fusing
throwing shots.
together criticism and humor, and using
Right.
humor as a kind of weapon, or you might even say something to leverage open the space in which genuine philosophy can come into play, and showing up the pretensions of
Hmm.
false philosophy.
Yeah,
So,
because that's a good because humor is such a great way of achieving perspective, right? It's kind of like when you ridicule something that so many people deem as so important and so pretentious. You show how pretentious it is. You show how arrogant they are being for thinking themselves above ridicule, right? This is why humility and jokes and things like that is such a deep method of critique, right? And it's not the same as just those, comedians who are making fun of, abused people, right? Making fun of trans people, for instance, saying, "Oh, blah blah blah, oh, cancel culture." I'm like, no, that's not how this works because what you're doing is when you use humor, right, to critique something, you're taking something down from a position of power, right? Way back in the day, this is where, how, and why they use humor to um kind of poke people's ego, right? It was meant to reduce the dominance of like those alpha males or the people in charge or anybody who had any sorts of power, right? And not just in like Middle Eastern times, like I'm sorry, Middle Eastern, Middle Ages, like what you see with the jesters and stuff, like the court jesters, that was their job, right? To be able to critique politics and other nobles without going a little bit too far, but it was meant to critique them. Versus, but that's not the only time. Like you also see it with the egalitarian cultures, right? With hunter gatherer cultures, especially for thousands of years, they did this. It's called reverse dominance tactics, where they, before any leader, any person can become a leader of that organization, like a chief or whatever, they haze them, right? You don't haze the regular people, you haze the people who are going to be leaders, so that you can puncture their ego, so that when they have that power, they don't abuse it, right? And so jokes and humor is used best when it's against a position of power, a position of kind of above or pedestal, things like that. So by just ridiculing things that are simple or it's literally a low blow, like it doesn't really it's literally punching low. It's not doing anything. It's not really giving you much insight there. You're just bullying. But by punching up, right, you can really boom bust that space open for people to understand and be able to communicate and associate and criticize, something that people previously deemed uncriticizable. So yeah, yeah, it's definitely I really liked how he did that, and it's really it was cool to see.
So, again, in this section, section 51, the big concern is with formalism. He's continuing the criticism he began in section 50, where he began talking about triadic schemas. In this one, it's not always going to be triadic. You notice that he talks in terms of two color schemas,
My
and
window
then even a
down.
monochromatic kind of thing at the end. So we want to follow this out. He says, instead of the inner life and self-movement of its existence, which is what we want to grasp through the phenomenology, this kind of simple determinateness of intuition, which means sense knowledge, knowledge of the sensible world, the world in which we live, move, experience, and like I put here, it's not just an experience world, it's also an experience of self, and it's also an experience of others and our relations with them. How are we going to make sense of that sensible world? One way is by taking some sort of schema, and this is what formalism does, and then just sort of superimposing it
Mm,
on the objects of sense knowledge. And Hegel says they call this construction, but what they're really doing is just a kind of analogizing.
mm,
And analogies can often be very useful, but we also have to be worried about analogies in some cases, whether we are just sort of, schematizing in a formalistic way
mm-hmm.
and not really contributing anything of value. And he's got his first joke here. He talks about asthenic and indirectly asthenic diseases and their modes of treatment. This is just one classification of different kinds of diseases. And he says, somebody'd have to be stupid not to be able to grasp that there's three kinds of diseases and three different kinds of treatments. And, then they can take the test and they can pass the class, they can, get their certificate, and, hey, we got a physician. But they don't really understand anything of the content that they were studying. They don't even know whether that schema is actually appropriate to the matters that they're studying. Here you see that.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to go on a little tangent here too, because this is another problem that you see, especially with boot camps and really almost every education system today. With I see this as a designer, as it's coming to this design space. You see that, and in coding, right? With a lot of software developers, you see that. You probably see in other places like cybersecurity, networks, or networking. Hardware design, all these other places, right? Where people learn just the formulas or a formula, and then they say, "Oh, okay, I'm a designer now. I'm a coder now. I know what to do." But they haven't really learned problem solving skills and problem finding skills and when to use which tool, right? And so they go into these jobs and think they can just be like, "Oh, yeah, I'm just use this process for everything," right? And I say that as a person who went to a boot camp and had to unlearn a lot of these processes. You think, oh, this is the design school, this is design thinking, or this is ideals design methodology, and so I'm going to use this design process for everything, right? I go in a project, okay, here's my ideation phase, here's my research phase here. But like, no, this is that's not how it works, right? You're being too formulaic, and it's really unfortunate that our education system does this. And yeah, I can go on, but like, I definitely understand that part. And what he was saying too about the analogy is very powerful. It's like what I was saying earlier about how in the last century people deemed, like, they saw it said the universe is like a machine. No, actually it's a machine. And we are the cog in the machine, or we are God's, or God made this for us to use, right? It's like what? No. Like, that analogy might have been useful in some aspects, but then you go way too much into it, thinking that this is the holy grail, and you misapply it to all these other situations, um, and it's troubling. It's really really bad.
Hegel, a lot of times people want to say, oh, he's so abstract, he has no respect for the real world, it's all idealism. No, he's actually saying that you can't just take abstract schemas and paste them onto the real world, you have to actually look at the real world, get your hands dirty, get them messy, and
Hmm.
then see what forms of thought might actually be appropriate to them,
Right.
and then apply them, see what you get out of it. So he says this kind of formalism of a philosophy of nature, and there were a lot of people doing philosophies of nature at the time, in part because, remember, we talked about the need to make sense out of the connection between metaphysics and the realm of thought and the sensible world that we actually experience and live in. That was
Hmm.
a problem bequeathed to them by Kant, who dealt with the
Bequeathed.
skeptical worries that other people had about the external world or reason or things like that by bifurcating the noumenal and the phenomenal.
Hmm.
And these are attempts to overcome that. A philosophy of nature is trying to reconnect those two. Now, how did they do it? Hegel says, the formalism of a philosophy of nature says, well, the understanding is electricity. What the hell does that mean? Does that actually tell us anything? That's as good as today saying, yeah, consciousness is brain states. Just repeat brain states often enough and show some MRIs, and sooner or later it all makes sense.
Right.
Well, you can do that, but that's not actually good science because you actually want to take account of what it is that we actually do experience. And you could do this for anything you like. We could make up crazy, silly examples of red and green and blue Kool-Aid and the taste that they bring and how those produce different states of consciousness. This is all just sort of made up nonsense. And Hegel's saying that's what these philosophies of nature really amounted to.
Mhm.
Saying that the animal is nitrogen, or that the understanding of the animal is equivalent to the North or South Pole. He's joking around here. He's saying, look, if you believe this sort of stuff, then why not make it anything you like? Why not say, well, we got these pieces of chalk here, and we got three of them. So here's the daddy, and here's the mommy, and here's the child. And we can make analogies all we want. Now look, here's the, if we want to get all Freudian with this, here's the Oedipal complex at work. See the daddy, the big piece of chalk, it's over here, and the mommy and the child are together, but now the mommy's over here, and now the little piece of chalk feels bad because you can do this sort of thing all day if you want to. Notice that we actually had to interject some real content there for
Mm.
this to mean anything. We had to interject some Freud. This is the problem with this schematic approach to things. So he says, now you're going to get people to like this. You're going to get people to say, wow, man, that makes sense.
Hmm.
He says, the untutored mind may be filled with admiration and astonishment and may venerate in it the profound work of genius. We do
Right.
like organization. We do like having things laid out for us. We do like having those moments where we say,
You like seeing
oh,
patterns.
now I
Yeah.
see how things fit together. The danger that Hegel sees with formalism is thinking that just because we've arranged things in some sort of order, that we actually have learned anything substantive
Hmm.
about it.
And it's very similar to like the problem of anthropomorphization, where you see, the human face or human form and other things, right? And that seems like a simple thing, but we do this problem with everything, right? With our pets, our dogs and cats. We say, oh, this looks like they're sad, because their eyes are a certain way, but their eyes function completely differently than ours, right? So if we project our thoughts and our understanding of emotions or anything onto them, then what happens? Then we completely misunderstand what that dog or cat is doing, right? And sure, it might work a little bit, right? We can obviously say, yeah, dogs and cats can be sad, and maybe they might look sad if they do a certain, pout or whatever. But then that analogy quickly falls apart once you actually watch them do other things, because that one moment of pouting might not, um, progress into all these other forms of sadness that we expect. So, when we take these analogies too far and take them for like the truth, like, oh, it's always true in in every situation, then it leads us to disaster. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize that and just keep on going with it.
And so he says, The knack of this kind of wisdom is as quickly learned as it is to practice, and he gives us a criterion for figuring out when this is the case. Does it get boring? Does it get stale?
Right.
Do we hear the same thing repeated over and over and over again and come to say, yeah, I know that song. I know how that one goes. I know where that line of thinking ends. You don't need to tell me anymore. I already know how to do it. If that's the case, then we're dealing with formalism. He says, we can liken this, and this is where he comes up with another great joke, we can liken this to a painter's palette having only 2 colors. Now notice, he doesn't say 3 colors, one for thesis, one for antithesis, one for synthesis, just 2. 2 will be enough. Because I suppose you could mix them together and have, your third color or something like that. But now notice how he says this. He says, painter's palette having only 2 colors, say red and green. Good enough. You can do a lot with red and green. One for coloring the surface when a historical scene is wanted, the other for landscapes. So
you don't mix them. You just be like, oh, this is one, this is the other.
With his generals, we're going to do that in red. Now the landscape over here, let's do that in green. What if there's some landscape over here? Well, I suppose we got to put some green over there. What if there's like, I'll figure maybe Napoleon was walking around in that woods. I will make him red. That would make some really crappy paintings, wouldn't it?
Right.
That is not how art works. And, the world that we experience, the world that we want to make sense of, through the, determinations of thought, we're not just saying, well, thought is over there and it's empty and boring and sterile. The world that we actually do experience and want to make sense of is multichromatic. Mm-hmm. Even if it was just black and white, we'd be better off than the red and green that he's talking about here.
Because of all the way it mixes together.
It would be hard to decide which is greater in all this. Now he's being sarcastic, right? The casual ease with which everything in heaven and earth and under the earth is coated with this broth of color. You don't have to have any talent to just slap colors around. All right, you can just get a big can of paint. We need some red over here. There we go. Now we'll smooth it around a bit. No white showing. Good to go. You may as well just be painting walls, but even those who are painting walls have to do some taping so that they don't get everything all messed up, right? And he says, or the conceit regarding the excellence of this universal recipe. Who would actually think that this is a viable way of painting things? Somebody.
I'm sorry, but there's this lady on that who was on I don't know what it was on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, but she painted her floor, right? And it was not good. Like she just spilled the paint bucket and then spread it all over the floor around piles of objects that she already had on the floor, right? So she had some trash or whatever, some piles of clothes, and she just put them on in different piles and just painted around it, just spread the paint. It was just so painful to see. I'm like, this is exactly what he's talking about. That's who does this.
Who doesn't know any better. And he says each supports the other. What results from this method of labeling is that all in heaven and earth, with the few determinations of the general schema and pigeonholing everything in this way. And here he targets Fichte, with his report clearer than noonday. Hegel thought that Fichte, who's one of his predecessors, he had made a few advances beyond Kant. At least he didn't think that everything was noumenal, that there was some sort of break. But he thought that Fichte degenerated into this kind of schematic formalism, and that it really didn't illuminate much of our experience at all. So he says it's like a skeleton with scraps of paper stuck all over it. So imagine the human skeleton, and instead of actual flesh and nerves and fluids and pick whatever else you like, you just have a bunch of Post-it notes. You say, here there would be some muscle, here there would be a sinew, here there would be a nerve. Now, I suppose you could come to understand something of that in a very imaginative way, if you actually knew what muscle was, or sinew, or ligaments, or any of these sorts of things. But if you don't already know that, it's not going to be very helpful, is it?
Right.
He has another example too. He says it's like rows of closed and labeled boxes in a grocer's stall. They're easy to read. It's a nice filing system, but you don't know anything after you look in the inside these drawers. You know, for those of us who remember card catalog systems in libraries, now you have electronic systems. It's not the same thing to look at the entry as it is to actually go get the book. Now, is it?
Mm.
Even the table of contents, you can't figure out what a book is just by reading the table of contents,
Right.
or the back blurb or something like that. You actually have to read the book. And it's the same way with the natural world. It's the same way with our experiences.
Okay, great
it's
way
the
of putting
same
that too.
way even with the world of thought. This sort of formalism is not even adequate for human beings to understand their own thinking or how other people think as well. So he says,
That's powerful.
not only is this, you know, troublesome because it's too abstract, it actually ends up giving way to a monochromaticism. That is, everything ends up being the same color. And you know, he talks about white in this case, you know, the white that's pure formlessness. And there, you know, we're talking about the abstract absolute that some people get into, which is really just their feelings sort of projected out into reality. I would actually say, you guys all remember when you were a kid and you had paints and you said, oh, I like this, mixing the yellow and blue makes green, and I can like add some white to it, now it's light green. This is really cool. Man, I wonder what happened if I mixed them all together. And then you got that ugly brownish gray color. I don't know what to call it, but other than say, you know, crappy mud or something along those lines. That's what this does. Because sooner or later it all just blends into one thing. And, you know, I think the greatest indictment of this kind of formalism,
That's what was
Hegel
indictment.
just sort of hints at this,
Indictment.
but I think that this is something that you can take from this. That kind of formalism gets awfully boring. And why do we get bored? Because we think there's something more than this. Something I'm not getting right here where I am. That's what makes this place boring. And I'd like to be over there. So Hegel is saying, you know, what do we need in order to do that? We actually need the concept. That's what we need to make sense out of our sense experience of the world of nature, of others, ourselves, the processes of thought, history, all those sorts of things. We cannot reduce them to schemas, even if it's the schema of thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Beautiful. That was such a great section there. I really liked, you know, how he went into depth there. He was throwing shots. Hegel was throwing shots, and I love it. Dropping bars, and I liked how Dr. Sadler broke it down into, you know, not just in terms of philosophy, but like you said, like you need this multi, you know, color or like multi-directional way of thinking for anything. If you want to be more aware of yourself, if you want to understand the world or any subject within it and things like that, you need to be able to see things from these different perspectives and utilize different ways of thinking, different ways of knowing, in order to, you know, come up with a comprehensive, you know, tapestry with the actual beautiful art piece and the actual, you know, good understanding of things. You can't just mash all these thoughts together in one little analogy and call it a day. So yeah, it was a great section here. Looking forward to the next. Uh, as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know, you know, what you learned from this, what you got from this. I would love to hear, you know, some insights. And as always, thanks again. Have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.